Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. We're just going to give another minute for the people still coming in. We'll get started shortly. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to RiskScout's monthly webinar. RiskScout is committed to providing insightful, thought-provoking content to bankers interested in starting and growing new business lines at their financial institutions. We provide a mix of personal and professional development to give you the tools you need to succeed. My name is Courtney Cromer, and I'll serve as your moderator today. Joining me on the call is Kristen Parker, who is the Director of Compliance at RiskScout, and Becky Poster, the COO of HDCS. Their combined expertise in this area of emerging markets should definitely make for a worthwhile webinar. And this month's webinar is entitled Going Higher and Higher, and it will help you expand your higher risk business line by efficiently and effectively keeping up with industry trends, new legislation on the horizon, and best practices in taking your existing program to the next level. And following the webinar, all registrants will receive a link to the recording via email, and we'll also leave some time towards the end of the hour for everyone to pose questions, which I will convey to our speakers. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please put it in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And yeah, I think that takes care of our housekeeping, so I'll turn it over to Becky and Kristen.
Thank you,
Courtney. Hi, guys. Good morning, or good afternoon, rather. My name is Kristen Parker, and I'm the Director of Compliance here at RiskScout. I have been in banking my whole professional career with a focus on BSA and compliance over the last decade or so. I come from a BSA officer chair, actually, where I ran my own higher risk making programs at about a $4 billion community bank. So I know all the pain points you're feeling if you're in this chair or in a bank in general or a financial institution running one of these programs. So I like to help you guys stay abreast. And I wish I would have had some of these resources when I was building out my own programs and keeping a pulse on the industry altogether. But I'm happy to be here with Becky. She is a good friend of RiskScout. HDCS is a great company, and we're excited to be talking through this with you guys today.
Yeah, hello. Thank y'all for joining us today and for what we hope is an informative webinar. I'm a veteran banker with over 20 years of experience, including both community and big banks, including internal audit. I created and implemented training programs, credit underwriter, and commercial lender. And most recently, I moved into cannabis banking and have become a subject matter expert in the cannabis industry, specifically around laws, regulations, and legislation. So I'm excited to be a part of today's presentation. And like Kristen said, HDCS and RiskScout do work seamlessly together, although we are two separate companies. We like to work together in this industry. And so for today's agenda, we're going to go over some best practices of what a successful cannabis banking program does look like, how to harness your existing cannabis customers, We're going to study some, we're going to look at some case studies and go over some frequently asked questions. And then we'll talk about, if we have time, we'll talk about the current status of state and federal legalization. Why I say if we have time, we really, our slides today are heavy with information. They are, have more information than what you would typically see in a presentation. And the point of that is so when these slides are emailed to you, you can print them off and use them for training for your staff, or even for an update on the cannabis industry for your next board meeting. So that's the intention of these. And so there's some information that's very handy to have on state and federal legalization that we may not have the time to go over today, but it is there for you to use later on.
There we are.
There's our faces. Okay, so the fundamentals of a cannabis banking program, we did feel like it was, even though this webinar was originally designed for people who are currently banking the industry, it's very good for people who are considering banking the industry to be on this call as well. And so we did want to go over what a successful cannabis banking program does look like.
Yeah, so when we talk about a cannabis banking program, we're specifically really speaking to the THC or marijuana banking side today. There are, considerations for hemp, but that's a whole nother webinar we could do together. So let's really take this in and focus on the THC side today. What we want to talk about with the core program components are really a key piece is understanding the market which you're entering. Really don't launch into a market without extensive research, because you may think you're going into a state that has a legal cannabis program in place, and they do probably, but you need to know the nuances of those states. Let's take into account California. There are counties that have different rules sets for cannabis than the state, and so you've got to really be knowledgeable of what you're getting into from a perspective of what you're going to have to look out for your customers, what you're going to have to check in with, what licensings you're going to have to get, who carries the bigger burden, because sometimes it's the growers may have different burdens than your retailer do. So really understanding, never enter a market that you don't truly understand and have taken a deep dive into. The other part is balancing risk versus opportunity. And what does that mean? Really, again, it's knowing the industry sectors in your market and where the burdens lie in regards to regulatory obligations. What does that really mean in context of cannabis banking? It's how risky are these businesses compared to my opportunity to grow and focus on my financial institution's strategic goals. So there may be some, again, industry sectors that cause a little bit more heartache, a little bit more burden to your compliance staffing and BSA staffing than others. So really understanding that there are different risks associated with each industry sector. And really that leads into proper interpretation of the true nature of the cannabis business to really understand those obligations from a BSA and compliance perspective. And when you look and dive into that a little deeper, what that really focuses on is which businesses require those reoccurring SAR filings versus those who don't. There are some institutions that have cannabis banking programs that only bank what people sometimes refer to as tier 2 and tier 3, not the plant touching businesses. And they choose to bank those because their interpretation and their buy-in from their regulators do not require them to file reoccurring SARs on those tier 2 and tier 3 clients. Now, again, you want to address that with your regulator to make sure everybody's on the same page there, but the consensus across regulatory regimes is it's those plant touching businesses that require those reoccurring SAR filings. And of course, with those filing obligations comes additional staffing or software needs. So it's really understanding all of those pieces to really know how robust your program is going to be and what you're going to need from a staffing perspective or software perspective or both.
Yeah, so here's The 3 R's, risk, reward, and resources. This is kind of one of HDCS's philosophies. Before any financial institution implements a new line of business, you want to discuss these 3 R's. What are the risks? What are the resources needed to mitigate that risk? And how do you make it profitable if you're going to enter one of the highest risk industries that there currently is? It's not the only high risk, but it's definitely considered one of the highest right now. So why take on the additional risk without making the profit, and what resources do you need? This is one of the questions that Chris and I get the most. How many additional staff will be needed to effectively monitor your cannabis banking program? And the answer is, well, it depends. It depends how you want to start your program and what your long-term goals are. And for example, are you going to just test the regulatory waters and offer your financial service to just a few clients? And like Kristen alluded to earlier, which clients are you going to want to offer to? Plant touching clients, which is sometimes referred to as tier 1, or the non-plant touching clients, which are referred to as tier 2 or tier 3, that offer ancillary services to the industry. And also, will you include hemp? Because although there are some specific guidance for banking hemp customers and members that state that you no longer require to file marijuana SARs, however, the due diligence will still need to be enhanced, similar to your THC clients. So that will, even if you want to just start with hemp, you still will need to consider the staffing issues of having a hemp program. And another thing, besides just dipping your toe in the water, do you want to maybe start off and be the market leader and have the majority of the licensees in your footprint? So those are different things to consider as you're considering implementing a cannabis banking program. And so with the small program, Chris and I have seen, 3 to 5 employees can be very effective. And then if you're running a large, robust program and you don't have monitoring or reporting technology to help you, it can take well over 10 employees to run an effective program.
Yeah, and that really leads us into talking about staffing, software, or both. We work really heavily at RiskScout with our each regulatory agency to really kind of get a pulse on what they're feeling, what they are going into, because more and more are being exposed to cannabis banking programs than they ever have in the past. And we all know that sometimes when we have our own at RiskScout, our own ex-examiner, OCC examiner on our staffing, who is the first to tell you that a lot of that, regulators have a lot of other things to worry about, and they're not so knowledgeable in this space that you get a lot of different opinions from these guys. But one thing that has remained consistent amongst all of these regulatory comments that we're getting back is, do you need staffing? Do you need software? Or do you need both? And what we're seeing is these guys come back and say, our job is to make sure that the institution is running a program that is reasonable in nature to safeguard that financial institution against illicit activity. Now, that's really the end goal for all BSA exams, is that's what they're looking for. But specific to cannabis, they want to know, what does it take to monitor one of these types of businesses? How many hours per month? And then they take that hours per month and multiply it by the number of businesses that you have. And they can clearly see at that point, are they in over their heads? Or do they have proper controls in place to help mitigate some of those risks by using software? So a successful and scalable program has to, no matter if you have staffing or if you have software or both, have a designated subject matter expert on staff, or they need to definitely partner with one that help them stay abreast of the industry ambiguities, because it can change from week to week and day to day. We can take, for example, and now this is a hemp-related example, but in Texas, Delta 8 became suddenly illegal it was maybe 3 weeks ago at this point. and then turned around and just yesterday it was turned over in a lawsuit, in an injunction to say it is legal until it goes through a full trial. If you're not keeping abreast of that through your own subject matter expert, you need to be partnering with one that you can that will keep the pulse on the industry for you, inform you of things that are pertinent to the states in which you're banking. So a staffing assessment at the time of launching a program is really important to determine staffing needs, and those assessment conclusions should be circulated and understood by all key stakeholders. What I like to tell people a lot, and if you've been on one of our webinars before, is I made the mistake of launching a program that I was very excited about. It was one of the first hemp programs in the United States, and I was ready to get it launched, and there was no really education points out there on what the burden was going to be. And I was so hungry as a BSA officer to do something else besides beneficial ownership, and I really wanted to be an advocate for my community, that I launched a program thinking I could do it myself along with all of my other BSA staffing duties. What I quickly learned is I made a mistake. I then had to go, because it became a if you build it, they will come scenario, build a dreams type situation, where I went from having 5 customers to 150 customers in a matter of months. And I had to go do that walk of shame to say I didn't do my needs assessment appropriately or accurately to really tell you guys that I needed staffing, or I needed software, or I needed both. And I ended up paying the price for that, because when suffering for quite a while, and it all worked out in the end. But it's just, don't be me is the moral of that story. Really, really circulate and help people understand that you are going to need more than one person to run this program.
All right, so now we're going to go into what I call the 3-tiered approach to a cannabis banking program. And the first tier we're going to talk about here is laying the foundation. Then the next one is attracting the right cannabis-related businesses, and then monitoring, reporting, and training. So laying the foundation is, you want to start, before you implement, you want to do a few things. You want to look through your existing BSA AML program. Were there any findings? Are there any pending findings? Because you want to make sure your current program is doing well before you enter a higher risk industry. And then risk assessment. So you want to create a thorough risk assessment specifically for the cannabis industry. And for example, I have one that my customers can use, and it's 54 pages long. It's very thorough, but it asks every question you need to consider before you enter the space. And it's also great to redo every year before your big exam. And then you want to create policies and procedures specific for your cannabis banking program, and you want to ensure that those policies and procedures match your risk assessment, and how that all fits in your operating plan, how that works. And then you also, as we've discussed, make sure you have the staffing in place. Are you going to have a robust program? Or are you going to start very small and pilot? Either way, you want to consider technology now and or later. And then training. There are a few good cannabis banking certifications that are out there that include monthly or quarterly training and updates. And those are very important for the staff that's very hands-on with your program. But with training, I want to note, you also want to cross-train your staff. As Kristen mentioned, if you lose your key cannabis employee, your program could become vulnerable to error, and therefore vulnerable for findings if not done correctly. So another thing that we've been seeing out there is that employees that have been in cannabis banking for a few years are getting poached by new financial institutions entering in the space. So you definitely want to have a cross-training plan.
Yeah, and they're saying this is the Great Resignation this time, and we're seeing it more and more and more. And yes. I think it's important to point out that when you don't have a subject matter expert contingency plan, your regulator is going to bring that up. They're going to want to know about it. So just keep that in mind.
Yes, and I've got some clients that are having difficulty due to COVID-related issues getting filling in positions, getting people back into the office place. They're struggling with that a little bit, and that's not unique for banking. That's everyone's feeling those pains.
Sure.
And then contingency plan. In your policies and procedures, you need to address how to properly terminate a cannabis-related business. If there's some red flags there and it's too frequent, you can, there's a termination star, and you definitely want to have policies and procedures in place with identifying termination and protecting your financial institution for asking someone to exit the financial institution. You'll also need a contingency plan if you need to exit the entire cannabis banking program, which could leave your financial institution in a vulnerable financial position. So you want to consider liquidity ratios, what you want to have in place, so that way, if for some reason you do need to exit your entire cannabis program for one reason or another, your financial institution will be able to continue without any major issues. And then lending, we'll talk a little bit more about lending, but you want to consider from the beginning if you think you might lend and when you think you should start lending. And we can talk about that here in a little bit.
Yeah, and then another key component is attracting the right cannabis-related businesses. One thing I mentioned earlier, and I will continue to mention, is that different parts of the cannabis industry as a whole has different sectors that carry their own type of burdens. And your institution needs to decide which of those industry sectors you're going to bank, and knowing that you need a way to filter through these businesses that are, because when they find out you have a cannabis banking program, they will flock to you in a minute, and you need a way to really filter out who it is that you're reviewing to potentially bank with you, so that you are utilizing and maximizing your staffing's time. And then after you have figured out that filtering section, vetting the CRBs is a huge point. You really need a way to check through multiple different factors about a business. Their licensing, who their beneficial owners are. And it may be news to you guys, but not a lot of cannabis related businesses have more than 20% ownership. They're usually owned by another entity, to where you really have to uncover a lot. So you may not want to use that 20% threshold for really understanding who the UBO is there. You may want to break that down even further. And then really having that open conversation with your cannabis related businesses to help them understand the burden you're having to go through to bank them, so that they know when you ask them for information, they have a short amount of time to get that back to you, because your operations are critical, and them being an active part of that relationship is going to help make your job easier. And then dealing with legacy cash is a big issue. You really need to talk through how your institution is going to deal with cash that existed prior to that business onboarding at your institution, and how are you going to mitigate and vet that cash, the source of the funds for that cash.
Yeah, and I wanted to add there too, like most states that have legalized sales have some kind of database that financial institutions can utilize to verify who the owners are and the beneficial owners and the type of business. Like for the state of California, for instance, they actually passed a bill, I believe it was last year, I think it was Bill 1525, that gives financial institutions the right to obtain that information. So that's a lot of states. And then there's some states whose programs are so new, they don't have these great databases that you can access electronically. But if you have to actually pick up the phone and call your local regulators, your cannabis regulators, about local licensees, they are willing and able to work with the financial institutions.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then just lastly on this piece of it is the monitoring and reporting. We know that it's really critical this is usually a cash intensive industry, is really sourcing your duty is to source those funds and ensure that they came from legitimate business practices. There are varying ways to do that. One thing we like to press on to people is to understand that it's not your job to police this industry to the itty bitty every single little transaction. You know, it's your job to have a reasonable program to protect your financial institution. And there are varying ways to go about that that don't require you policing every little transaction that goes through. Regardless, you know, you're going to have, if you're tier 1 clients, or, you know, tier 2, tier 3, based on whatever your interpretation is of that 2014 fencing guidance, that the SAR obligation exists and the CTRs. One thing I want to point out about the CTRs is if you are using an armored car service, it is your responsibility to be filing the currency transaction reports. If you have not been doing so, contact me. I've seen it happen a lot of times. It actually happened to myself, unfortunately, at an institution I was at. It's not a fun process to go through. So ensure that if you are using armored car services for this industry sector that you're banking, that is your obligation. And again, you need to have a robust audit and exam trail for you know, because we live in this world if it's not documented, it did not happen. So make sure that you've got your ducks in a row for each client, not just from a policy and procedure standpoint, but for each client that you've really done your due diligence and robust due diligence at that.
Yeah, so now we're gonna go into the section about expanding your existing program. So if you have a small, oh, I'm getting a feedback.
You're good on my end, Becky.
Okay. You have a small, I wonder if it's my, if you have a small pilot cannabis banking program, when and why should you expand your program? And this varies for each FI, but some of the triggers are there's additional legalization in your state. Maybe your state just legalized medical sales, or your state has added adult use. And so that may trigger a financial institution to realize that they might need to grow the program larger. Another thing is competition. New financial institutions are moving into the space and creating competition. So you want to maintain your market share, and simply it could be you're ready to expand because you wanted to start a small program with the intention of growing it eventually. So you're ready to expand. And so you want to know why you're going to take on the additional risk without the return. So it's very difficult to, so you definitely need effectively the program from the start. So it's difficult to increase prices as your program grows, especially if you have a new financial institution entering the space and creating competition. If your program was priced too low, you may not be able to generate the profitability to continue long term. And if you've priced too high, you could potentially lose your clients to competition. So, and the industry is already, the cannabis industry is already suffering from overpricing. So, and that's something that, like Chris and I have talked about, like advisors can help you with knowing what is appropriate for your state, because each state is different from the next. You need to know how many licenses have been issued and will be issued in your state. Is there a cap? For example, the state of Louisiana has legalized medical sales. However, there are only 9 locations to purchase medical marijuana. There's only 7 licensees, and two of those locations are medical dispensaries, and the other ones are just pharmacies. And for the state of Texas, it has a population of 29 million, but only about 4,000 patients in their medical program. So having a robust program in a state like that would be impossible. So, you know, you also want to know where your state is at the consideration process. Like, for instance, there's a good chance that the state of Mississippi will legalize medical this year. If not, they'll probably get it on the ballot for 2022. And cannabis sales in other states with medical programs may expand into adult use within the next few months or the next 24 months. So you want to know where your state's at. So you get a good idea about how robust your program can be. Or if you don't really want to bank the industry, you want to know if your state is about to legalize, and then you'll have to layer in some extra protections there. And then so you'll want to consider monitoring software if you don't already have one in place. And I think Kristen can really speak to this.
Yeah, you know, if you have a small program and only a handful of clients, you may be able to do that manually for some amount of time. But really over time, it's important to take into consideration that this industry doesn't really fit the rule set of traditional transaction monitoring. So we're seeing a lot of institutions really dive into variance tracking to really understand the inflow of the sales versus the inflow of the core deposits into their institution, and really see if there's a difference, to understand if maybe there's some legacy cash coming in, maybe there's some unaccounted for cash that they need to question with the industry. But again, it's up to the size of how big your program is. And really, if you're going to get into this space to begin with, the risk is usually not worth it if you have a small program that you're not going to scale up. But that's another conversation probably for another day, right, Becky?
Exactly. Right. And then we want to talk about going out to market. We kind of touched on this earlier. I know Kristen mentioned it, that you want to consider how you're going to vet, how you're going to find those cannabis related businesses. And more than likely, you don't have to do any advertising. You don't have to put a sign on your website or on your door that says, "We bank the industry," because it is a tight knit industry. And once people realize that you are banking the industry, they will begin coming to you. But we do have some clients that actively go out to market, where they go to cannabis related conventions, and we do some webinars together and some other press together, because they're trying to maintain their market share. And another thing too about going out to market is, whatever your liquidity ratios are, most financial institutions meet their limit and fill up their programs quickly.
Yeah. And what I will say about, marketing your program, just because we work so intimately alongside actual businesses, a lot of the times cannabis related businesses, not just the banks itself, is they have a hard time trusting institutions that don't openly talk about their program, because they feel like the rug could be quickly pulled out from under them, which is a fair assessment to be made, just given what's happened in this industry altogether. So consider that if you're looking at scaling up and growing your program, really to get those sticky deposits, those customers that are going to be with you for a while. Building that trust factor goes both ways.
So here is a very simplistic example of what a robust cannabis banking program looks like. And it's under the assumption too that it's added some technology to assist with the monitoring and reporting. So it shows the year one, you'll need to maybe add some additional staff in the beginning, but you typically won't need to add additional staff as your program continues to grow.
Yeah, and that's within consideration if you invest in software, typically, from that perspective. Because if you're going to continue to do it manually, you will have to add some staffing if your program grows, right, Becky?
Exactly right.
Sure.
So oh, sorry. What, Kristen?
No, go ahead, Becky. Go for it.
So in protecting your program from competition, so we've done a few things. We have a financial institution that did a customer survey, and for all their cannabis businesses, to see what they are struggling with obtaining, whether it's investments, HR, payroll, insurance, for health benefits for their employees, armored car services, and other securities. And that bank provides their cannabis clients with the list of vetted businesses that do provide services to the cannabis industry, just as an added layer of service for especially their new clients that are just got their license approved and are trying to figure out where they can get insurance. You know, they're that source that financial institutions are used to being a source for their businesses, their business clients, of how to better improve their business. And so this is just another way that you can add a service for your customer. We'll talk about lending next too, but lending is a great way to get your clients to stay around. And another thing that we can do is you've got your call report analysis. So my CEO, he started his own community bank, started de novo banks in Southern California and Utah. And so he's great at reading financial institutions' call reports and analyzing how your current program can work better for your bottom line and what a possibly scaled program could look like for your bottom line. So with lending, what we advise for lending is you definitely want to start small and conservatively, and we ideally advise that you have your cannabis banking depository program has gone through, you've got it up and running, you've got clients, you've gone through 1, maybe 2 exams, and you're in a good spot. So now it's time to utilize your balance sheet and offer some lending services to your clients. But definitely start small and conservatively. Identify your top performing cannabis related businesses. So if you've been in the business for a while, in the space for a while, you know exactly who are your top performers, as in they give you documentation as requested quickly, and they're very consistent. You'll want to definitely conduct a separate risk assessment for a cannabis lending program, and you'll want to also have specific policies, procedures, your risk, and your allowance methodology specific for the cannabis lending program. And it can be inside your current lending program, but you definitely want to address the specific different nature of lending to this industry. And we definitely suggest that you start with certain types of lending that you want to do, whether it's multi-purpose equipment or maybe even multi-use real estate that could be easily sold into the secondary market if needed. But and then as maybe you get used to lending to the cannabis industry and you've gone through an exam or 2 there, you can then layer on a little bit riskier lending if that is within your approved risk appetite. So now we're going to talk about some case studies, some specific examples of what financial institutions have been or other instances that are happening in the industry. So this one is a bank in Oklahoma. The title, the headline reads, "A recent Oklahoma U.S. District Court case reflects the cannabis industry's big problem with banking." And so this is something that is very well known in the cannabis industry, is that there are a lot of businesses that have a banking relationship. It's just their bank doesn't realize it. So this dispensary owner did plead guilty by telling his bank that his company was a wellness and fitness company instead of a chain of medical marijuana dispensaries. He pled guilty to laundering more than $770,000, and he could face some prison time and some really heavy fines. So some key takeaways as a financial institution is that some enhanced due diligence could have prevented this. Because if there is some form of legalization in your state, you want to pay extra attention to new corporate accounts, that especially ones that are under management or consulting. Wellness is a big one that we mentioned earlier. So you do want to have an extra due diligence program for all new businesses, just to verify that that business is what they are actually saying they are. And your lenders can help with this, because if it's a business that also has some kind of loan, your lenders should be doing a site visit audit just as a natural part of the lending process. So they can help with verifying that as well. One thing to also note is that even if your institution welcomes the cannabis industry, some cannabis businesses still try to conceal that they're in the industry to avoid the possible higher fees. And then, of course, initial and ongoing site visit audits are essential. You will know eventually if the business is not who they say they are. But I know we don't do site visit audits for every business, but again, your lenders could help verify certain things for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say if you are at an institution that says, I'm not banking these people, like Becky said, you probably are. They oftentimes are truthful when they first onboard. Maybe they were in a different industry type and then have switched over and become part of the cannabis industry where there's risk for commingling of funds. So regardless of whether or not you have a cannabis program or you do not have a cannabis program, you need to address it in your policies and procedures about how you are banking it or you're not. And that needs to be well circulated in your institution so that they know how to really uncover these businesses and really do their due diligence from the time, because a lot of times they're just walking into an institution to your front line and they're just going through the motions and not knowing how to really identify these businesses. And I'll just give you an example about on-site visits, how they're important. You know, I had somebody in the hemp industry who was very you know, supposedly doing big things in the industry, running through a lot of investor money, and was not very forthcoming with information. Finally agreed to a site visit. It was the middle of summer. He had spent, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had 4 tiny hemp plants still in their seedling little black boxes. And they were, you know, were tiny for midsummer, and it was quickly a realization that something, you know, was concrete, and my suspicions that something wasn't right here. If I hadn't gone there, he could have easily continued to run through that money. It's just so critical. Don't let site visits get away from you. And if you have put site visits on hold because of COVID-19, please make sure that's in your you know, board meeting minutes, that you guys recognize that there's risks to that and that you are going to resume them as soon as it's safe to do so. And then we're going to talk about this Michigan Credit Union. Probably by now you've likely heard about them, but it was earlier this year they got a cease and desist for their cannabis banking program that was pretty large in size. They weren't just banking cannabis, they were banking ATMs and MSBs and other things, but they had software in place, but they just didn't have the proper educated staffing to understand the very basic obligations that they needed to be fulfilling. And they didn't have that education for SAR filings or the staffing to do them in a timely manner. And as a result, they got a cease and desist order and had to end their program altogether. So really some case study notes here, some takeaways, is that, you know, you have to really understand that you need a subject matter expert on staff that is dedicated to this industry and that has strict oversight of all the basic regulatory requirements. And just knowing you can't slap software on something and think it's going to run the whole program in and of itself. It's going to still need people behind it that know what they're doing. You may not need as many people as if you were running a completely manual program, but you're still going to need people because there's still going to be work to do. And, you know, again, talking about policies and procedures and ensuring that your actual day-to-day actions line up with your policies and procedures that have been approved by the board.
And then for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this this case study number 3, but you will have it in the slides. It's pretty interesting. And then we're going to do some frequently asked questions next. So here's a question that I experience a lot is my next regulatory exam is right around the corner and my institution has an active cannabis program. Are there additional steps I should take? So what I like to advise is if you do have an exam approaching, make sure you've updated your risk assessment. Ideally, you should have a separate risk assessment specific for the cannabis industry and your cannabis banking program. Review your BSA AML policy and your cannabis banking policy to ensure your risk assessment and procedures match what is in your policy. I see more findings over that than anything. And then review, ensure you have informed your oh, this one's Kristen. I want you to talk about this one because this one's good.
Yeah, so ensuring your regulators are always in the loop of what size your program is so critical, because what we see a lot is institutions will, you know, be gung-ho with their regulators and get them on board to begin with, and then maybe they update them 6 months after the program's launched and it's still small, but then their next exam comes. Maybe that's 12, 18 months later, and that program has blown up and is much larger in size than what you had originally intended with or had talked through with your regulator. What we're seeing is the regulators show up and they think that this you know, bank has 5, 10, 20 clients and they have 300, 400, and that sets a really bad tone to begin a regulatory exam with. You really, really want them to come in with the right amount of staffing to do a thorough exam of not just your cannabis banking program, but all the other BSA boxes they have to check while they're doing your exam. You don't want them to feel overwhelmed when they come in, and they don't want to feel left out of the loop. So the better that they're informed and keeping a pulse on your industry, the size that you're banking, who you're banking in the industry, will help them better assess who they need to bring with them to help examine you. It's just super, super critical. And again, be prepared to have a conversation regarding your staffing size. It is happening at every institution. We are seeing through their cannabis exam, or their BSA exam, when their cannabis program is being brought up, every time it's been that question asked about staffing. So just be prepared.
That's true.
Just to interject, ladies, we're at about 1/4 till.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll have time. We've got 2 more frequently asked questions, and then I'll do a FinCEN quarterly update. I bet that will probably be right at the time we need to. So number 2, we are considering implementing a cannabis banking program. How best can I present the potential program to our board of directors? And so I think the first place you want to start is educating your board on state and federal legalization and why the cannabis industry is considered higher risk. And just knowing also that if it's in your footprint, more than likely it's in your financial institution. So you definitely want to address the risks to not banking the cannabis industry or especially banking the cannabis industry. And talk about how your institution can mitigate those risks. And you can demonstrate to your board the research of what you've done and what a safe and profitable program can look like for your institution. And the next step after you get kind of a green light from your board is to complete a risk assessment and present findings to the board so that they may holistically assess the risk of cannabis banking to your financial institution. I think, Kristen, you have some examples of that.
Yeah, I just think it's important prior to actually going to do a full-blown risk assessment, because we all know that risk assessments are so not fun to do, is get that really feel for whether or not your board has the even slightest risk appetite for wanting to do cannabis banking after they've been educated a little bit on what that would entail. After they say, I think we might be into that, then completing a really robust risk assessment to present back the findings so they can see, you know, now they're educated on the industry itself, but now they're going to, through the risk assessment, be educated on how that industry and banking the industry is going to affect your institution specifically, and they will from there be able to make an educated decision based on your strategic goals and risk appetite. Okay,
then our last question, and I'm a BSA officer wearing several hats. How do me and my team stay up to date on the ever-changing cannabis industry?
Well, we can't express enough that subject matter expert piece. That's huge, huge, huge. If you are unable to dedicate a subject matter expert, you need to partner with one. Regardless of that, really attending targeted training on regulatory updates specific to your footprint are important. So if there's, associations that are putting on maybe quarterly or semi-annual updates, regulatory updates for your specific footprint, it's really important and pertinent that you actually attend those to stay abreast of what's changing, what you're seeing, keep a pulse on the industry. And any cannabis related changes, industry changes that are critical need to be communicated and again, well circulated with key stakeholders, including the board of directors, because it may change how they are tolerant of your program.
Okay, so our FinCEN quarterly marijuana update. So the last, most recent update from FinCEN is dated June 30th of this year, and there were 706 financial institutions that filed marijuana-related SARs. 518 of those were banks, 188 were credit unions, and there were 203 1,000 total file SARs. And I'd like to show the comparison there. Back in 2017, there were only 28,751 SARs filed, and a little over 360 financial institutions that were filing those. And also today, Kristen asked me this question the other day. So to date, there's been a total of 1,626,000 marijuana-related SARs filed.
Wow,
So
that's incredible.
they started monitoring it in 2017.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's safe to say that less than 700 financial institutions have active cannabis banking programs. And Kristen, I think that number is significantly less. But even though that FinCEN reported that there were 706 financial institutions that filed, some of those financial institutions were filing termination SARs that do not wish to bank the industry.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out here, just because you filed a SAR doesn't mean you have an active cannabis program. Maybe you just identified them one-off. It could be 1, 2, 3 SARs coming from a single institution. So I think people get lost in that 700 number when we realistically think it's 150 or less institutions actually serving this industry, which shows there's tremendous opportunity for getting out there and really taking a hold of this industry and making it a good revenue option for your institution.
Yeah, for the sake of time, the next slides that we're going to show you will you get to take home for free. They're really just to give you an update about what's going on state legalization, who's probably going to legalize next, what the dollar amount looks like as far as global cannabis sales, what federal legalization is pending and how that could affect the industry. That's all there for you to use for training or your next board meeting, and to also demonstrate we are subject matter experts in that for you if that extension of your team is needed. So here's our takeaways from today. There is an effective, proven 3-tiered approach to a successful comprehensive cannabis banking program. And what I say by proven is that Chris and I have both been through several exams, and we've gone through several without findings. So it's a proven method. You want to review and update your program before your next exam. Lending can strengthen an existing cannabis program, but start conservatively. And when you read through the other slides, there are 40 states that have some form of legalization and even more that have decriminalized. So the cannabis industry is not going anywhere, except for it's going to continue. And then federal legalization is on the horizon. However, cannabis will always be considered a higher risk business.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, ladies, for going into so much detail and all of that. We definitely have some questions. We have about 7-8 minutes left, so we can go over a few that people sent in. The first one is, someone said, you spoke about ensuring you have proper staffing to run a cannabis program, but finding qualified staff these days can be challenging. And they want to know, how can I really assess how much staff I need, and how can I communicate my staffing needs versus the program's strategic goal for my bank's key stakeholders?
Yeah, I can speak to that, Becky, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Sure. So really understanding how much staffing you're going to need is how much of a concentration of clients you're going to have. Are you going to scale up? Are you going to just keep it to minimum? If you have minimum and you're running it manually, you may only need a handful of staffing. If you plan to do everything manually and you have 200 clients, you're going to need a whole room full of staffing likely, but you're not going to know until you really assess what your software can do if you've invested in that compared to what it would take to manually run one of these programs. And you can really assess that through a risk assessment, but you won't really get a pulse on it until you understand what the burdens are in that specific sector that you're banking in the specific part of the country as to how far you're going to have to take that monitoring piece.
Right. Yeah. And we can, our email addresses are here, so you're welcome to email us with specific questions and we can help you with that.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question. You suggested lending is an option for taking your program to the next level. I find that interesting since I've always heard that lending to the cannabis industry is too risky. Can you expand on why you believe lending in this space is safe, and do you have any success stories on that?
Okay, yes. So you're 100% right. Lending is definitely a layer of the program to add in after you're used to your cannabis depository program, because it's a different staffing. You've got your chief lending officer. It's a whole different crew that will get involved, and they're also known to be your most conservative crew in your bank. So it takes a minute. So what's been incenting my clients to get into lending is competition. They've been in the space for several years. Now they've got local banks wanting to compete against them. So they've layered in lending to help create sticky customers. And those institutions that are implementing lending, they started banking the industry to be a service to their community. And they see them as not only helping their community by banking the unbanked, but also being a place for them to safely bank and not have that cash out on the street creating a safety issue. But so lending's another layer of servicing their clients. And again, like I mentioned, you want to start very small and conservatively, pick out your top clients and the ones that have been consistent. And you also want to identify what type of lending you want to do. So we've got, like I said, like multi-use equipment or multi-purpose real estate. And then you might eventually layer on more specific to the cannabis industry as your program's been approved. And we have implemented a lending program in one financial institution, and we're about to implement another one very quickly. We did draft a letter for their OCC regulators and presented the program to them, and we got a non-objection.
Awesome. Okay.
Question.
Alrighty. I think we have time for one more quick one. Do you believe that if the SAFE Banking Bill ever passes or federal legalization happens, cannabis will still be considered high risk and be as much of a burden to bank as it is now?
Yeah, I think so. I do too, because you know what? MSBs have been legal money service businesses, for those don't familiar with what MSBs are, have been legal a long time, and they are frankly still a pain to bank and a burden because they're still considered higher risk. I think, there's always just going to be industry sectors that have that stigma about them, and rightfully so, because I think there's going to be cash intensive for quite a while. There's still going to be licensing that has to be ensured is up to date. If you're, banking, let's say you're banking the hemp industry, and hemp is literally the only plant you can plant a legal seed in the ground and it grows until an illegal plant because of the THC levels. So there's always going to be some nuances and burdens in this industry altogether that are going to make this be considered higher risk for at least a while. You'll probably see some relief from SAR filing obligations. Well, hopefully that's the case. But you're still, still going to have some more obligations than you do for just your average, grocery store that you're banking.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Because even if we have federal legalization, the thing is, there's not really another industry out there where you have legal and compliant licensed businesses competing against the illicit market. And so you still got that, because like Canada's showing that they have federal legalization, but their black market is still doing well. So that doesn't go away. So you still will need to demonstrate to your regulators that you've got the best practices in place to help prevent money laundering.
That definitely makes sense. Okay, well, for the sake of time, I think we should stop here. Just want to say a big thank you to Kristen and Becky for eloquently doing a deep dive into these topics and having a great webinar. And like we said, all registrants will receive a link to the recording via email. So just for your use later on. And yeah, thank you everyone again for joining us, and hope to see you at a future webinar as well, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.